Impeachment investigation. Public hearings resume in the probe into President Donald Trump and his dealings with Ukraine. We have team coverage and analysis. Change in the Middle East. The Trump administration reverses 4 decades of U.S. policy on Israeli settlements in the West Bank. We have reaction. Vatican Bank. We examine recent unrest in the Holy See's finances. And preparing for the Pope. A look at the Catholic history of one of the cities the Holy Father will visit in Japan. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, November 19th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. The impeachment inquiry hearings continue as America listens to 2 witnesses who heard President Donald Trump's phone call with Ukraine's president. One is a career Army officer, the other a Foreign Service official. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi kicks off our team coverage. Jason?
Wyatt, this whole impeachment investigation started by the complaint from an anonymous whistleblower. Today, a lieutenant colonel says he does not know who that anonymous whistleblower is, but he says he did bring his own complaints to the proper authorities, going through his proper chain of command.
Testifying today,
so help you God,
2 aides who listened to President Donald Trump's call with Ukraine's president.
I found the July 25th phone call unusual.
Jennifer Williams, a State Department employee assigned as a special advisor to the Vice President's office. And Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, a Purple Heart recipient serving on the National Security Council.
It was improper for the president to request and to demand an investigation into a political opponent.
He says the president's ambassador to the European Union also pressured Ukraine.
Ambassador Sondland said that in order to get a White House meeting, the Ukrainians would have to provide a deliverable, which is investigations, specific investigations.
But Williams says the issue of investigations didn't get brought up in another meeting.
During the September 1st meeting, neither the Vice President nor President Zelensky mentioned the specific investigations discussed during the July 25th phone call.
Republicans questioned if the lieutenant colonel was the source of leaks.
You did not discuss this with the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, CNN, or any other media outlet.
I did not.
Your boss had concerns about your judgment. Your former boss, Dr. Hill, had concerns about your judgment. Your colleagues had concerns about your judgment. And your colleagues felt that there were times when you leaked information.
Vindman admits a Ukrainian official asked him if he wanted to serve as that country's Minister of Defense.
Every single time I dismissed it. Upon returning, I notified my chain of command.
The Army Lieutenant Colonel did offer this advice to Ukraine's president.
Stay out of U.S. domestic policy.
Do you mean politics?
Politics.
Vindman said he has a sense of duty. He says he summarized the call between President Trump and Ukraine's president to about 12 people, including someone outside of the National Security Council with a need to know. Now, Republicans asked follow-up questions, and the Democratic leader of the committee stopped the line of questioning, saying he would not allow the whistleblower's identity to be revealed. Wyatt?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. President Donald Trump slammed the ongoing hearings as a disgrace in kangaroo court, while acknowledging he watched part of the 3rd day of public hearings. The president made the comments at the start of a cabinet meeting. White House correspondent Mark Irons has that report. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. The president blasted Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, commented on one of today's witnesses, and also credited Republicans for their handling of the hearings.
The Republicans are absolutely killing it. They are doing so well because it's a scam. It's a big scam. They're doing something that the founders never thought possible and the founders didn't want. And they're using this impeachment hoax for their own political gain to try and damage the Republican Party and damage the president.
President Trump also reacted to impeachment witness Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman in his testimony in today's hearing.
I never saw the man. I understand now he wears his uniform when he goes in. No, I don't know Vindman at all. What I do know is that even he said that the transcript was correct.
The president went on to call Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi grossly incompetent for focusing on impeachment rather than working to pass the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement trade deal. And after the hearing, White House Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham released a statement saying, in part, today's hearing only further exposes that Chairman Schiff and the Democrats are simply blinded by their hatred for Donald Trump and rabid desire to overturn the outcome of a free and fair election. Wyatt.
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Join me now from Capitol Hill is Representative Jackie Walorski, Republican from Indiana. Congresswoman, welcome back to the program. You've been following this impeachment inquiry. You sat in on public hearings last week. What are your impressions so far?
You know, my impression is it is an absolute sham. I wish there was another way to describe the amount of time and the amount of money that's being used up, the oxygen out of the air when it comes to what's happening by these Democrats. But I think the American people are seeing what I saw, which is a sham. And to think about what we could be doing, you know, we could be funding our military right now. We could be moving a trade bill that's really important to workers and manufacturers in this country, but we're not. We're wasting time, we're wasting money. And I tell you, you know, I was just in our district this weekend, and nobody asks me when I'm at home in northern Indiana about this sham that's going on. They want to know when we're going to pass things that make their quality of life better and continue to bring the momentum in our economy and to keep that at the standard that it is right now. It's so disappointing. It is mind-blowing. It's mind-boggling to think that just, you know, so many feet away from here, this charade is going on. And I just think it's a disaster. I think my district thinks it's a disaster, and I think the American people think it's a disaster as well. It's like we have great opportunities here that we're squandering. So I hope this comes to a conclusion very, very soon.
And we've been hearing from other House members with similar sentiments from their constituents. Switching gears a little bit, Representative, when you were on the broadcast last, we talked about the horrific discovery of thousands of baby body parts on abortionist Ulrich Klopfer's property. Since then, you've introduced legislation to ensure the bodies of aborted children are always treated with dignity. So what specifically would the Dignity for Aborted Children Act do?
Yeah, so it would really mimic Indiana's current legislation, which basically says that when a child is killed in an abortion, that their remains are treated like any other human being remains, and that those then must either be cremated or dealt with like or buried like any place else would be. The mother gets the option of being able to keep those remains or letting it go to the abortionist at a hospital or wherever. But I think the important part of this bill more than anything is the reporting requirement. If we don't have the abortion providers to actually report back as to what they did with the disposition of that body, we'll never know because they're not going to volunteer that information. And I think when we look at additional oversight for these abortion doctors and people wonder why, look no further than what Klopfer did. You know, I have been after him for more than 10 years in the state of Indiana. He performed thousands of abortions in our state, including my own district in South Bend and in that area. So, you know, I wasn't surprised at all at what a monster he was created and what he did. So after his death, I was not surprised at the kind of heinous things that we found. And we want to make sure that this never happens again. A, it happened. B, it never should have. C, let's make these guys report so it never happens again. And we have an absolute tracker on the disposition of children that die in an abortion, just like any other human being. What has the response been like so far to your measure? Well, we have more than 50 co-sponsors on that bill, and I think when people on the Republican side of the aisle for sure heard about what was happening there, it was just such a heinous act. And being able to go across state lines and taking babies with you, I mean, it's such a horrible thing to even think about. You know, even pro-choicers sometimes have been taken aback by what Klopfer did. And I think that just in our base as human beings, we understand that was absolutely horrific. It was heinous. Let's make sure it doesn't happen again. And I think, you know, with our continued, you know, getting additional members as we go through as co-sponsors, you know, we're doing this to educate the public, to educate Americans, and to move a bill in this place that will put those kind of parameters of safety back on. But I think that just as case in point is as to why we need more oversight with these abortion providers. I'm sure there are so many across the country who agree with you about that. We'll continue to follow the bill, by the way, such an important issue. Representative Jackie Walorski, Republican from Indiana, thank you so much for talking with us today. Thank you so much.
The Taliban has released an American and an Australian who has been held hostage since 2016. In exchange, 3 top Taliban prisoners were released by Afghanistan's government. The American, Kevin King, and the Australian, Timothy Weeks, are safe with U.S. officials and are receiving medical treatment. Around 600 anti-government protesters are seen leaving a university campus in Hong Kong. The demonstrators wore face masks and thermal blankets. They were photographed by police before they were allowed to leave. An estimated 100 to 300 people remain on the campus. Security forces have surrounded Hong Kong Polytechnic, which has become a focal point for the demonstrations. United Nations officials are calling on the authorities to do everything they can to ease the tension between police and protesters. Officials in Sweden say the sexual assault investigation into WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is over. The prosecutor says weak evidence is one of the main reasons. Assange remains in prison in Britain and is serving a nearly 1-year sentence for jumping bail. Assange is also fighting extradition to the United States, which accuses him of publishing secret documents. The government in Hungary signs a special agreement with an Orthodox Jewish group. The accord grants the Unified Hungarian Jewish Congregation a special status enjoyed by only a small number of churches. For instance, it will give their schools similar financing as those received by state institutions. One point of tension for some churches in Hungary has been a controversial law introduced in 2012, which said Parliament must vote in favor of a church for it to be officially recognized. The second International Conference on Christian Persecution will be next week in Budapest. The Hungarian Embassy to the Holy See is sponsoring the event to raise awareness. According to a British interim report, 80% of persecuted religious believers around the world are Christians. Hungary is also preparing for the 52nd International Eucharistic Congress. That meeting is to help young and old deepen their knowledge and respect for the Eucharist. The Congress was initiated by a lay Frenchwoman in 1881 and happens every 4 years in the Central European country. Ambassador Edward Habsburg, Hungarian ambassador to the Holy See, joins us from Rome. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for your time today. Why is this conference on persecuted Christians so important?
Hungary is trying to help persecuted Christians all over the world since about 3 years. And we do 2 things. We help and we raise awareness. So this conference is part of the Raising Awareness. It's the second conference we are doing. And the idea is to get people interested in the topic and to find partners in helping persecuted Christians.
Well, as you say, Hungary's been working on this issue for several years. Have you seen any progress in helping those Christians? And what is your country and the embassy doing to help them specifically?
Absolutely, Wyatt. We are working mostly in the Middle East and in the sub-Saharan countries, and we are doing concrete help. Hungary has spent $40 million in the last 3 years in building schools, rebuilding churches, helping out concretely on the ground. We also have a program where we help students to come to Hungary, study a subject, and then go back to their communities and help build them up again. And that's quite a lot for a small country like ours. And as I like to say, if you spend $40 million on something, you have to take it away somewhere else. So it's a decision to do that. And that's why Hungary is very happy that the United States are a strong voice against religious intolerance, for religious freedom. And we've partnered up with USAID, and we're doing projects together with the United States. So we're proud of that. Other countries are coming in, are joining the team, because, you know, people don't always react with great interest if you speak about persecuted Christians. The fact is that out of 10 people who are persecuted for their faith, 8 are Christians. But if you tell people we help persecuted Christians, the reaction is often, oh dear. So we're not a very attractive minority, and but it's a silent catastrophe going on. And therefore Hungary really tries to call out and to raise awareness.
What is the Catholic culture like in Hungary, and how will this Eucharistic Congress help bridge the gap between young people and the church?
Well, to give you the numbers, 63% of Hungarians are Catholic, 15% are Calvinists. Hungarian Calvinists, the Reformatus, are very strong Christians speaking about their faith. And I think that having people from 70, 80 countries, young people coming to Hungary and interacting, talking about their faith, going to pray in our churches, singing songs with Hungarian young Catholics and other Christians will do a lot for Hungary. But not just for Hungary. Most people don't know Hungary or haven't been there. So it's worthwhile going there in September 2020 and meeting Hungary from a religious point of view, meeting Hungarian faith, Hungarian culture. I think it will be a great event.
So interesting, of course, to hear a little bit about that history and about the Catholic culture that is there in Hungary. Ambassador Edward Habsburg, Hungarian Ambassador to the Holy See, thank you so much for joining us today.
It was a pleasure, Wyatt. Thank you.
Coming up, analysis of the Trump administration's change in policy in the Middle East. The Trump administration says it no longer considers Israeli settlements in the West Bank to be a violation of international law. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the change yesterday, which reverses 4 decades of American policy.
Calling the establishment of civilian settlements inconsistent with international law hasn't worked. It hasn't advanced the cause of peace. The hard truth is, there will never be a judicial resolution to the conflict, and arguments about who is right and wrong as a matter of international law will not bring peace. This is a complex political problem that can only be solved by negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Pompeo went on to say the United States remains deeply committed to helping facilitate peace. Joining me now with his analysis is Matthew RJ Broadsky, Senior Fellow at the Gold Institute for International Strategy. Matthew, welcome back to the broadcast. This announcement, as you know, has been met with mixed reactions. What's your initial thoughts?
Initial thoughts are it's great. It's, first of all, recognizes reality, which is important. Sometimes that's an important thing to have happen in the Middle East peace process. Recognizing that the capital of Israel is Jerusalem, as the Trump administration did. It's also a recognition of reality. These are smart moves.
The situation in the West Bank is so different than even it was several decades ago. Now there's over 400,000 settlers that live in the West Bank. What are the practical implications for them? Does this move affect them in any way?
As for their day-to-day life, no, it's not actually going to change much of anything on the ground. What it does is simply recognizes reality for what it is. These are Jewish communities in their Holy Land, and it basically isn't going to change much policy or anything else. It doesn't even affect the end game of negotiations. It simply means the U.S. isn't going to be involved in zoning and land disputes in another country's land. Why should it be?
Palestinians have condemned the decision, saying it undercuts chances of a broader peace deal. What impact do you think this will have on negotiations if the Palestinians are simply more angry about this?
Right. I think it's a tired kind of talking point that, everything is going to be the worst thing and it just kills the chance of negotiations, as though there's been some vibrant peace process that has occurred or that has worked over the years. The fact is, this is a smart move that recognizes reality, and it doesn't preclude any type of negotiated settlement in the end. And I think dealing with Palestinian mythology is very important to be done. To the extent that they keep believing that everyone else is going to hand them something and they don't need to show up, negotiate, and make the compromises necessary to end the conflict, then it makes peace that much further away. Recognizing reality, not mythology, brings us closer to peace.
It's interesting. The Trump administration has made a number of noteworthy moves. You mentioned recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital being one of them. Another one was recognizing Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights. But some critics say these moves and then closing the Palestinian diplomatic offices in Washington undermine the credibility of the administration to be there in the peace process. How do you respond to that?
Right. These are the typical type of viewpoints. Right. Now, the United States recognized the PLO to begin with at the very beginning of the Oslo process well over decades ago. Now, their purpose is supposed to be to negotiate some form of settlement with Israel. When they decide that they're not going to engage in negotiations, but what they're going to do is either launch terror attacks or be in some political deadlock or do nothing to advance peace, there's no reason the United States should keep them on welfare if they're not going to engage. It's we give them money for a specific purpose. It's not American welfare.
Certainly is an interesting way that the U.S. is going about with all of these interesting, noteworthy moves. Matthew RJ Broadsky, Senior Fellow at the Gold Institute for International Strategy, thanks so much for your analysis.
Pleasure.
Up next, why the Vatican's finances are coming under close scrutiny. And the Holy Father's trip to Japan includes a visit to a historically important city. A board member of the Vatican's financial watchdog has resigned. The move comes after Pope Francis decided not to renew the contract of the watchdog's president yesterday. The Vatican says it will appoint a new president next week, but the board member with the Financial Information Authority says ousting the president leaves their group an empty shell. In October, Vatican police raided the watchdog group's offices. Authorities seized documents and computers as part of an internal investigation into investment in a London real estate venture. Join us now is Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency and a canon lawyer. Ed, welcome back to the show. Did Pope Francis give any reason for not renewing the contract of this head of the Vatican financial watchdog?
We haven't seen any real compelling reason given for this, and there has been a really very high turnover in almost every Vatican financial oversight position over the last 5 years. We've seen the departure of an Auditor General, we've seen the departure of the President of the Vatican Bank, the IOR, and now this.
And I want to follow up with that because last week, Holy Father named Father Juan Antonio Guerrero Alves as the Vatican's new economic chief. Does that have any impact on the Pope's decision, or do you think?
Well, so the Pope did name a new head of the Prefecture for the Economy, a position formerly held by Cardinal Pell. That, in a sense, is progress because that role has obviously been functionally vacant for quite some time now. Whether or not that impacted directly on this decision, we simply don't know yet. It's possible that he's looking to have a complete changing of the guard. It's possible that the two timings are just coincidental. Again, we don't know. For a series of departments that are meant to bring transparency, we don't actually have a very good understanding or insight into these moves.
Even with all the timing of this, what do you make of the timing of this decision also for the board member to resign?
Well, Mark Odendahl, who was the board member who resigned, saying that effectively they'd been left as a shell now, I think he has a point. The Edgemont Group, which is a group of 130 financial information authorities across different countries, have basically suspended the Vatican's AIF from their information sharing network, saying that they can't really have credit in them at the moment. And I think in the light of that, it's hard to see this as being an inappropriate reaction or an overreaction to the state of things. They now have 3 members of what's supposed to be a 5-member board. They have a director who's recently returned from a suspension following a raid on his offices by Vatican gendarmes. So really, things don't look great.
Yeah, a lot of issues. Is there any update, by the way, on the police raid, on the investigation into the Vatican's investment in a real estate venture?
There's not really been any update given on either the process following the police raids or the progress of that investigation. However, we're learning more and more all the time about the property deal in London that was at the center of all of this. We've just posted a new article on Catholic News Agency today giving new details about that, and I think we're going to see a lot more coming out about that because what seems to have happened is, at least in this one deal, because it involves a high level of public registration in a city like London, we're getting a more than usual behind-the-scenes glimpse into all of the moving parts in these investments.
And of course, we'll encourage our viewers to continue to follow Catholic News Agency as you guys continue to investigate and update on this. Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency and a canon lawyer. Thanks so much.
Always a pleasure.
Finally tonight, Pope Francis leaves for his 2-nation trip to Asia. He arrives in Japan for his second stop later this week. On his itinerary there is a visit to a city with a rich Catholic history. The Pope will visit Nagasaki, where Christianity first took hold in Japan. Nearly 500 years later, it remains steeped in symbolism. Catholic converts went underground there during centuries of violent persecution. In 1945, the U.S. atom bomb brought death and destruction to the city's cathedral and community. The Japanese archbishop was exposed to radiation in his mother's womb when the bomb fell. And the Holy Father will likely honor those Japanese Christians who hid from persecution for centuries. He'll also lay out his vision for a future free from nuclear weapons. So be sure to stay with EWTN all this week as we'll continue to provide updates on his apostolic trip. And with that, we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.